let earth receive her king. Let every heart.
The Boy's Gift by Carla Moore. Thomas Weatherly stared at the box on his porch with a scowl. The elderly gentleman held the wooden rail for support and bent down to get a closer look. The address was correct, but the name on the package was blank. He wasn't expecting anything. This must be a mistake. He looked up to hail the delivery driver, but she was out of sight. She was racing to get all her deliveries made on this Christmas Eve, and he shivered in the crisp evening wind and reluctantly reached for the box. It was light, much to his relief, and not too cumbersome for the frail man to carry through the door of his cozy home. He was greeted by the gray, one-eyed cat who had adopted Mr. Weatherly more than 5 years past. The feline had been welcome company. "What do you think this is, Joe?" The man's voice was soft and wobbly. The cat meowed, eagerly awaiting the removal of whatever useless item was taking up residence in what was certain to be his Christmas present. "I don't think it's ours, boy." Mr. Weatherly chucked the box onto the sofa and let out a groan as he took a seat in his favorite recliner. Joe refused to concede. He purred and rubbed his body on the corners of the box as if to tell his friend he loved his gift and couldn't wait to curl up inside it. "Don't get too used to it," warned the old man as he reached for his TV remote. "We're just going to have to send it back." After a short nap, Mr. Weatherly awoke to find Joe cuddled up in the box. He managed to pull himself out of his chair and head for the kitchen. The sound of the can opener and the smell of fish prompted Joe to abandon his new toy. Mr. Weatherly stared at the box as the two feasted on tuna and crackers. His curiosity was growing. He hadn't ordered anything. No one would be sending him a gift. There was no one left in his life. He fell asleep that night wondering which of his neighbors was missing a package. The next morning, Mr. Weatherly was determined to solve the mystery. Joe jumped onto the couch after breakfast and rubbed the box with his haunches. "Okay," said the old man. "Maybe whatever's in there will give us a clue. Let's just open the darn thing." He retrieved his pocket knife and sliced the tape down the middle of the package. He felt a tinge of excitement run up his arm. It had been many years since he opened a gift of any kind. Joe paced and purred. Finally, it was open. Mr. Weatherly looked at Joe with a sparkle in his faded eyes. "Here we go, boy." His heart picked up a beat as he reached inside the box. He let out a gasp when he pulled out a brand new baseball mitt. "Look at that." He turned it over and studied every detail. "I used to have one of these when I was a boy." The cat didn't care. He dove into the empty box and rattled the packing paper with his paws. Mr. Weatherly rubbed his knobby fingers over the leather. "I used to play, you know." Joe stuck his head out of the box and replied with a squeak. "My father bought me a mitt when I was 8 years old." His voice became smooth. "My God, that was so long ago." He sat back with a melancholy smile. "My friends and I couldn't wait for school to let out. We'd hit the field every chance we got." The memories became vivid. "I was a pitcher, and my best friend Jimmy was a catcher." He looked down lovingly at the mitt. "I can't count the hours we spent practicing playing stickball in the street, rubbing down our mitts and running through the grass." He smiled throughout his entire soul. "We played from Little League all through high school." Joe must have noticed the mist in his friend's eyes. He leapt from the box and rubbed his face on the mitt. Mr. Weatherly snickered and petted his faithful companion. "I was Tommy then," he said with a grin. "After college I became Tom." His voice became stern. Then it was Thomas. He sat up and stared at the wall, clutching the mitt. "Somewhere along the way I became Mr. Weatherly. I don't know how that happened." He turned to Joe. "How did I get so old so fast?" Joe didn't have the answer. "I remember playing baseball like it was yesterday. I still feel that little boy inside. But," he looked down at his hands, "but I'm more leathery than this mitt now. My eyes are worse than yours and my ears have failed me. I couldn't hear the crack of the bat if I hit one out of the park." He took a deep breath and dropped his head. Joe pawed at his friend. "Let me just sit here a minute, okay? I just want to sit here and go back in time for a little while." Joe jumped back into his beloved empty box and curled up for a nap. After a few moments of reflection, Mr. Weatherly came back to reality. He was sure the mitt was intended for the boy who lived next door. The family of 3 had moved into the house in the spring. He had never met them, but he felt he knew them. After the former neighbors moved out, he saw a for sale sign go up and then come down. He watched the movers unpack the truck, and he smiled as the family took a photo in front of the yard of their new home. He would watch for hours as the boy played catch with his friends on the quiet street. He witnessed all this from his living room through a window into a world that had forgotten him. One day, a missed catch caused the ball to roll into Mr. Weatherly's front yard. The boy cautiously stepped onto the grass to retrieve the ball. He looked at the window and caught sight of the old man watching them play. Mr. Weatherly waved to let the boy know that he wasn't in trouble for being on his lawn. The boy waved back then and scampered away with the ball. He realized this boy had just awakened on Christmas morning, missing one very special gift. He couldn't let the lad miss out on the memories that had warmed his heart when he saw the mitt. He dressed in his warmest flannel jacket and stocking cap and boots and made the short walk to the boy's house next door. As he approached, Mr. Weatherly could hear laughter on the other side of the door. He rang the bell and waited. The door swung open and a young mother greeted him with a smile and a bigger Merry Christmas. The smell of spices wafted past him. "Merry Christmas," he replied with a nod. "I'm Thomas Weatherly. I live next door." "Oh, yes. So glad to finally meet you. I'm Allison. Please come in." "No, thank you. I'm just here to drop this off. I think it was delivered to my house by mistake." Allison turned and called out, "Jake, someone is here for you." Mr. Weatherly was relieved. I was right, he thought. It's the missing gift for the boy. She's probably been looking everywhere for it. The boy, about 8 years old, ran to the door in blue pajamas and bare feet. His mother made the introductions. "Jacob, this is Thomas Weatherly from next door." Mr. Weatherly offered a kind smile. "Hello, Jacob." "Hi, nice to meet you, Mr. Weatherly," said the boy, practicing his best manners. You can call me Thomas." "Okay, Tommy." Mr. Weatherly felt new air fill his old lungs. Did I actually say Tommy? It didn't matter. He liked the sound of it. The boy chirped, "Well, you can call me Jake." "Okay, Jake." He was so delighted by the boy's youthful energy, he almost forgot the reason for the visit. "This was on my porch, but I think it belongs to you." Jake shook his head. "No, sir, it's not mine." Mr. Weatherly paused, and he cocked his head and looked to Allison for an explanation. and she just smiled. He looked back at Jake and asked, "Well, how do you know?" "Because I got it for you, Mr. Weatherly. Maybe when you have time, we can pitch." Hey y'all, thanks for clicking on the video. This is a Christmas podcast. This is going to be uploaded either the day before Christmas Eve or on Christmas Eve, I don't know. It's just Christmas stories. We'll get back to Bigfoot encounters next week. I've had some questions via email and through the comments. Yes, I'm working on another Steve Lilly installment. It's a pretty good one. I meant to get it up a couple of weeks ago, but I got hammered with work and I have to make a living, y'all. So I had to perform on that and get that done. And it's hard to do that and do podcasts at the same time. But I got that job submitted, so I'm free for a couple of weeks. I'm going to get that Steve Lilly story done and hopefully out before the new year. In this podcast, I've got 3 Christmas stories. They're not Bigfoot related. But the last story is a chapter from an audiobook that was just released this week. The title of the book is called Tracks. The author is Jack LaFountain. A lot of you guys hear me talk about him quite a bit because I've been doing a lot of audiobooks that he authors. This in particular is a set of short stories. It's 5 hours long. It's an audiobook that is nothing but Bigfoot encounters. And I think if you follow this Bigfoot topic, you will love this audiobook. It's 4 hour and a half long short stories in one book that I think you guys are going to love. And that's what the last story in this set is. It's a chapter from that book. Again, it's called Tracks. The author is Jack LaFountain. It is available on Audible for sale right now. I'll put a link in the description. All right, that's all I wanted to say. Hope you guys are having a Merry Christmas. All right, here we go. The Present by Peter Weigel. The old woman lay awake in bed, staring at dawn's first light dancing across the ceiling. She had spent most of the night trapped somewhere between reality and a dream, between a cold bed and her dead husband's warm embrace. She blinked, expecting tears at the thought of him, but there were none. Her husband died suddenly the previous day. It was a heart attack on Christmas Eve. For the first time in 58 years, she was alone in their bed. She turned her head to where her husband would normally lay. Unexpectedly, all she found was a stiff pillow and empty sheets. Maybe if she closed her eyes, she could find her way back to that dream. The one where he was holding her and humming one of his silly tunes. She smiled and let her eyelids drop over her eyes, hoping for one last Christmas with him. That was when she heard the bird. Its first squawk jerked her back to her frigid reality. An empty bed, a Christmas alone. The second squawk was louder than the first and seemed to pierce through her skull. She swore, why had her husband ever bought that bird? The third squawk drove her to action. She slowly turned onto her side and then lowered her legs to the floor. With great effort, she managed to push herself up using her elbows. The woman slid her feet into a pair of worn slippers on the ground, and then with a creaking of bones that could rival a rusty bicycle wheel, she managed to stand. Lacking the agility of her youth, she slowly shuffled out the door and down the hall toward the kitchen and the bird's cage. The bird seemed to sense her movements because it hadn't made a sound since she rose from the bed. Finally, turning the corner into the kitchen, the woman came face to face with her tormentor. The bird was a white cockatoo with a splash of yellow along its crest. It was inside a metal cage hanging 5 feet above the floor and looked right at the woman with its little dark eyes. It let out a questioning squawk as if to ask, "Where's my food?" The woman never wanted her husband to have a pet bird. They're loud and they're smelly and useless, and she remembered saying to him in this very room, "Why would he ever want a bird?" She thought back to that argument, trying to picture every detail of her husband's wrinkled face. Even the bad times were worth remembering for her now. The bird clicked its beak, breaking the woman's daydream. She groaned and decided then and there that she would give the bird to a local shelter as soon as the holidays were over. For the next few days, though, she was stuck with it, which meant she had to feed it. With great effort, the woman bent down to a nearby cupboard where she knew her husband kept the bird seed. The maneuver was not so easy as it had been even a few years ago. She needed to carefully balance her weight as she went down, mentally monitoring her body for sudden muscle failures or flashes of pain. A fall at her age could be fatal. Opening the cupboard was even more torturous for the woman. The arthritis in her hands was particularly bad this morning, so much so that even attempting to grip the cupboard door handle felt like squeezing a pile of needles. Eventually, she managed to get her straightened fingers into the handle and pull her whole arm to bring the door open, but there was no way she would be able to open the bag of bird seed. Instead, she delicately stood herself up, grabbed a knife between her palms, sliced the bag of birdseed open, and unlatched the cockatoo's cage by wedging the knife into the handle and twisting her whole body. Let it eat to its heart's content, she thought of the bird. It is Christmas after all, and maybe, with any luck, it'll gorge itself to death. The woman didn't get her way. The bird didn't sprint towards its food, nor did it immediately fly out of its cage. All it did was tilt its head and look at the woman. The woman grudgingly stared back at the bird for a few moments and then rolled her eyes and turned to begin her slow shuffle back to her room. Maybe then she'd be able to find a way back to the dream with her husband so they could have another Christmas together, even if only in her mind. A flutter of wings and a swoosh of air startled her as the bird flew past her head, causing her to emit a yelp. Bloody bird, she thought as she calmed her nerves and looked to see where the creature went. She found it perched atop a wrapped gift below the Christmas tree in the adjacent living room. Her husband had put up that tree just last week, bless his heart. The woman smiled at the memory. She had managed to place a few ornaments before her arthritis got the better of her. If she closed her eyes, she could see him there, stringing lights around the tree with the Deck the Halls playing in the background, and then coming over to warm her hands in his own. She reached her hands out to him as he came over, hopeful for his touch. As if on command, the bird squawked, seemingly determined to keep the woman unhappy. Her eyes opened and quickly narrowed in frustration at the cockatoo. That was when she noticed the gift that it stood upon was foreign to her. It was medium-sized and rectangular and wrapped in a gold and white paper. Because of her arthritis, all the gifts she prepared were in bags. Curious now, she made her way to the wrapped gift, passing several presents intended for her husband. In her mind, she recognized each of his gifts through the thick bags and tissue paper. That small red and white bag held a watch, while the larger one in the corner was a sweater. Her arrival at the unknown gold and white present caused the bird to fly off it to a nearby couch. The old woman bent over to pick up the gift and managed to grasp it between her two hands. Focused on the gift, she sat on the couch without realizing the bird was next to her, and she read the label to find that it was to her from her husband. She slowly smiled, so she would get to spend one last Christmas with him in a way. The woman made to open the gift, but couldn't undo the ribbon with her immobile fingers. And try as she might, her poor fingers wouldn't, No, they couldn't bend to grab the ribbon. For minutes she struggled to undo the wrapping, more and more frantically as time wore on. She needed to open this gift. She couldn't live a second longer without his love. The bird was not blind to all of this. It flitted up onto the woman's lap, who at this point was frantically pawing at the ribbon. The bird's weight on her leg caused her to pause and consider the bird. Gently and carefully, the brave cockatoo closed its beak around one of the tied pieces of ribbon. It twisted its head, and suddenly the ribbon was cut. The woman gave a shout of joy, and without thinking, pet the bird along its back. The cockatoo cooed lovingly. Next, to work through the wrapping paper. The bird fits its beak inside one of the paper seams and pulled while the woman held the box on her lap. With some amount of rotation, this method eventually led to the two of them opening the gift. Inside was a photo album, and on the front cover it read, "Our Adventure Together," below a black and white picture of the woman and her husband smiling next to each other on their first date a long, long time ago. Tears welled up in the old woman's eyes, the first since his passing. Her husband was there, right in front of her, as handsome as ever. She rubbed her fingers over his face, knowing it wouldn't bring him back, but hoping all the same. The bird nuzzled against her hand and then used his beak to pull the cover open. Images of family and friends spread across the better part of a century greeted her. They were laughing and smiling. And there beside her, always, was her loving husband, holding her, kissing her, celebrating with her. She wiped more tears from her eyes. What a way to spend a life. In that way, cockatoo turning pages and the woman reliving her past, the two of them spent this Christmas beside each other, brought together by one man's last gift to those he loved the most. The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. $1.87. That was all. And 60 cents of it was in pennies. Pennies saved 1 and 2 at a time by bulldozing the grocer and the vegetable man and the butcher until one's cheeks burned with the silent imputation of parsimony that such close dealing implied. 3 times Della counted it. $1.87. And the next day would be Christmas. There was clearly nothing to do but flop down on the shabby little couch and howl, so Della did that. Which instigates the moral reflection that life is made up of sobs, sniffles, and smiles, with sniffles predominating. While the mistress of the home is gradually subsiding from the first stage to the second, take a look at the home. It is a furnished flat at $8 per week. It is a plain dwelling without any flash of decor. In the vestibule below there is a letter box into which no letter will go and an electric button from which no mortal finger could coax a ring. Also appertaining thereunto was a card bearing the name Mr. James Dillingham Young. The Dillingham had been flung to the breeze during the former period of prosperity when its possessor was being paid $30 a week. Now, when the income was shrunk to $20, though, they were thinking seriously of contracting a modest and unassuming D. But whenever Mr. James Dillingham Young came home and reached his flat above, he was called Jim and greatly hugged by Mrs. James Dillingham Young, already introduced to you as Della, which is all very good. Della finished her cry and attended to her cheeks with a powder rag. She stood by the window and looked out at the gray cat walking a gray fence in a gray backyard. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day, and she had only $1.87 with which to buy Jim a present. She had been saving every penny she could for months, and this was the result. $20 a week doesn't go far. Expenses had been greater than she had calculated. They always are. Only $1.87 to buy a present for her Jim. Her Jim. Many a happy hour she had spent planning for something nice for him, something fine and rare and sterling, something just a little bit near to being worthy of the honor of being owned by Jim. There was a pier glass between the windows of the room. Perhaps you have seen a pier glass in an $8 flat. A very thin and very agile person may, by observing his reflection in a rapid sequence of longitudinal strips, obtain a fairly accurate conception of his looks. Della, being slender, had mastered the art. Suddenly she whirled from the window and stood before the glass. Her eyes were shining brilliantly, but her face had lost its color within 20 seconds. Rapidly, she pulled down her hair and let it fall to its full length. Now there are two possessions of the James Dillingham Youngs in which they both took a mighty pride. One was Jim's gold watch that had been his father's and his grandfather's. The other was Della's hair. Had the Queen of Sheba lived in the flat across the air shaft, Della would have let her hair hang out the window some day to dry, just to deprecate Her Majesty's jewels and gifts. Had King Solomon been the janitor with all his treasures piled up in the basement, Jim would have pulled out his watch every time he passed, just to see him pluck at his beard from envy. So now Della's beautiful hair fell about her rippling and shining like a cascade of brown waters. It reached below her knee and made itself almost a garment for her. And then she did it up again nervously and quickly, and once she faltered for a minute and stood still while a tear or two splashed on the worn red carpet. On went her old brown jacket, and on went her old brown hat. And with a whirl of skirts and with the brilliant sparkle still in her eyes, she fluttered out the door and down the stairs to the street. Where she stopped, the sign read, Madame Sofroni, hair goods of all kinds. One flight up, Della ran and collected herself, panting. Will you buy my hair? Asked Della. I buy hair, said Madame. Take your hat off and let's have a sight at the looks of it. And down rippled the brown cascade. $20, said the madam, lifting the mass with a practiced hand. Give it to me quick, said Della. The next 2 hours tripped by on rosy wings. Forget the hashed metaphor. She was ransacking the stores for Jim a present. She found it at last. It surely had been made for Jim and no one else. There was no other like it in any of the stores, and she had turned all of them inside out. It was a platinum fob chain, simple in design, properly proclaiming its value by substance alone, as all good things should do. It was even worthy of the watch. As soon as she saw it, she knew that it must be Jim's. It was just like him. Quietness and value, the description applied to both. $21 they took from her for it, and she hurried home with 87 cents. With that chain on his watch, Jim might be properly anxious about the time in any company. Grand as the watch was, he sometimes looked at it on the sly on account of the old leather strap that he used in place of a chain. When Della reached home, her intoxication gave way a little to prudence and reason. She got out her curling irons and went to work repairing the ravages made by generosity added to love. which is always a tremendous task, dear friends, a mammoth task. Within 40 minutes, her hair was covered with tiny, close-lying curls that made her look wonderfully like a truant schoolboy. She looked at her reflection in the mirror long, carefully, and critically. "If Jim doesn't kill me," she said to herself, "before he takes a second look at me, he'll say I look like a Coney Island chorus girl. But what could I do? What could I do with $1.87? At 7 o'clock, the coffee was made and the frying pan was on the back of the stove, hot and ready to cook the chops. Jim was never late. Della doubled the fob chain on her hand and sat in the corner of the table near the door that he always entered. Then she heard his step on the stair away down on the first flight, and she turned white for just a moment. She had a habit of saying a little silent prayer about the simplest everyday things, and now she whispered, "Please, God, make him think that I'm still pretty." The door opened and Jim stepped in and closed it. He looked thin and very serious. Poor fellow, he was only 22, and to be burdened with a family. He needed a new overcoat, and he was without gloves. Jim stopped inside the door, as immovable as a setter at the scent of a quail. His eyes were fixed upon Della, and there was an expression in them that she could not read, and it terrified her. It was not anger, nor surprise, nor disapproval, nor horror, nor any of the sentiments that she had been prepared for. He simply stared at her fixedly with that peculiar expression on his face. Della wriggled off the table and went for him. "Jim, darling," she cried, "don't look at me that way. I had my hair cut off and sold it because I could not have lived through Christmas without giving you a present. It'll grow out again. You won't mind, will you? I just had to do it. My hair grows awfully fast. Please say Merry Christmas, Jim. Let's be happy. You don't know what a beautiful, nice gift I've got for you." "You've cut off your hair?" Jim asked laboriously, as if he had not arrived at that patent fact yet, even after the hardest mental labor. "I cut it off and I sold it," said Della. "Don't you like me just as well anyhow? I'm me without hair, ain't I?" Jim looked about the room curiously. "You say your hair is gone," he said, with an air almost of idiocy. "You needn't look for it," said Della. "It's sold, I tell you, sold and gone, too. It's Christmas Eve, boy. Be good to me, for it went for you. Maybe the hairs of my head were numbered." And she went on with a sudden serious sweetness. "But nobody could ever count my love for you. Shall I put the chops on, Jim?" Out of his trance, Jim seemed quickly to wake. He embraced his Della, and for 10 seconds let us regard with discreet scrutiny some inconsequential object in the other direction. $8 a week or $1 million a year, what is the difference? A mathematician or a wit would give you the wrong answer. The magi brought valuable gifts, but that was not among them. This dark assertion will be illuminated later on. Jim drew a package from his overcoat pocket, and he threw it upon the table. "Don't make any mistake, Dell," he said. "I don't think there's anything in the way of a haircut or a shave or a shampoo that could make me like my girl any less. But if you'll unwrap that package, you may see why you had me going a while at first." White fingers tore at the string and paper, and then an ecstatic scream of joy, and then, alas, a quick feminine change to hysterical tears and wails, necessitating the immediate employment of all the comforting powers of the Lord of the Flat. For there lay the combs, the set of combs, side and back, that Della had worshipped long in a Broadway window. Beautiful combs, pure tortoise shell, with jeweled rims. just the shade to wear in the beautiful vanished hair. They were expensive combs, she knew, and her heart had simply craved and yearned over them without the least hope of possession. And now they were hers. But the tresses that should have adorned the coveted adornments were gone. But she hugged them to her chest, and at length she was able to look up with dim eyes and smile and say, "My hair grows fast, Jim." And then Della leaped up like a little cat and she cried, "Oh, oh!" Jim had not yet seen his beautiful present. She held it out to him eagerly upon her open palm. The dull precious metal seemed to flash with a reflection of her bright and ardent spirit. "Isn't it a dandy, Jim? I hunted all over town to find it. You'll have to look at the time 100 times a day now. Give me your watch. I want to see how it looks on it." Instead of obeying, Jim tumbled down on the couch and put his hands under the back of his head, and he smiled. "Dell," he said, "let's put our Christmas presents away and keep 'em a while. They're too nice to use just at the present. I sold the watch to get the money to buy your combs. And now, suppose you put the chops on." The Magi, as you know, were wise men, wonderfully wise men who brought gifts to the babe in the manger. They invented the art of giving Christmas presents. Being wise, their gifts were no doubt wise ones, possibly bearing the privilege of exchange in case of duplication. And there I have lamely related to you the uneventful chronicle of two foolish children in a flat who most unwisely sacrificed for each other the greatest treasures of their house. But in a last word to the wise of these days, let it be said that of all who give gifts, these two were the wisest. They are the Magi. All right, hope you guys enjoyed those Christmas stories. Here is a chapter from the audiobook Tracks, again, that was just released this week. There'll be a link in the description for the Audible page for Tracks, or you can go to my website and see all the audiobooks that I have available right now. But this is the newest. It's 5 hours long. It's a great book. Here's a chapter from Tracks by Jack LaFountain. Chapter 1. He watched the doe from the shelter of the rocks. Her long legs were buried in a drift that brushed her belly. To reach the mouthful of leaves still clinging to the branch over her head, she would have to balance both front legs against the trunk while standing up on her back legs and stretch her neck as far as she could. It would take all of her concentration. He wished he were closer, but there was neither time nor opportunity for that. He would have to strike from where he was, and it was iffy. So too was the chance that food this close to home would appear again any time soon. The snow was up to his knees, and it was only the cold moon. The deep drifts would slow him, but the doe faced a similar challenge. Any other time he would wait for a better chance, and this was not any other time. The sky, the trees, and the vanishing game told him this snow season offered few chances. He must take each one and succeed to live. He exhaled slowly. He had to risk it, even if he failed and drove the deer from the area. He waited for the leaves and the hunger to overcome her caution. She would reach for the leaves and he would move. The powerful muscles in his legs coiled, readying for the moment to strike. She bounced once, a feeble feint. She bounced again and found the trunk with her hooves and extended her neck in a fluid movement. He exploded from his crouch as her lips touched the leaves. He landed on both feet, and in a single heartbeat, his right leg launched the next step, propelling him forward in a shower of loose white powder. "Oop, Irad." He threw the long, reverberating roar of his name behind the next stride and followed with another huge surge forward. The roar had the desired effect. The doe froze for a fraction of a second, but it was all he needed. His chest hit her body, taking her off her feet. His strong arm embraced her, holding on tight. Sharp hooves flew in a wild attempt to break free. His lesser hand wound over her shoulders, and he spun her legs in the air, and with a rapid, powerful downward motion, snapped her spine over his knee. The flailing stopped. Her breathing soon followed it to a standstill. Irad threw the doe across his back and turned for home. Low clouds heavy with snow hung just above the treetops. He labored through some drifts that reached his thighs as he forced a path to his den. His muscles ached with the climb up the hill through snow, but his mind was far from the present exertion. The gathering storm lay heavy upon his skin and his thoughts. The weight of the air pressed in on him, thick and cold as the snow he trampled through. He could sense the rising fury behind in the clouds that turned the light into darkness. By the next sunrise, not that he would see a sunrise any time soon, the snow would be up to his crotch. Ada would scarce be able to push her way through the drifts that would surely cover little Jabal's head. What was worse, the doe he carried on his shoulder would be gone by then. Their meal was as thin as they were, and it would not last long. Irad pressed under the cross trees he had fashioned to mark the boundaries of his home, cutting a deep swath as he went. The fresh snow would obliterate his tracks in short order and keep them safe, at least from the hairless hay that stalked the woods with their thunderous killing sticks. He picked up his pace, still hoping to reach the den before dark. When he finally pushed aside the limbs covering the entrance and stepped inside, stomping his feet and shaking the mantle of snow from his head and shoulders, darkness had fallen. He threw the deer down at Ada's feet with a grunt of satisfaction he didn't feel. She glanced at the offering, but made no gesture of thanks. Her look told him she shared his meager assessment of the food. She sawed her nails through the doe's hide and ripped it away from the meat. Irad chose a sharp stone from the recesses of the shelter and opened the soft middle of the deer. Unbridled fervor sent hands diving into the tender organs. The sun would return eventually to find their bellies empty, but that moment was the time for feasting. He pulled the heart from the chest and chewed the fibrous flesh with relish. As he ate, he watched Jabal sitting at his mother's side, eating with carefree abandon. Last snow season had been easy. The snow was light, the game was plentiful, and the baby had his mother's milk. This season differed from the start. The snow came early, wet and heavy. Fierce north winds stripped bare the trees and piled up drifts to cover the shrubs. Just like themselves, the deer and birds that remained were starving. The ponds and streams were thick with ice, and they had already used up all their stored plants, nuts, and berries. Irad knew that he was not the only creature to sense the power of the coming snowstorm. Everything had been on the move. For a few suns already, ominous expectancy had hung in the air with the scent the wind could not carry away. The snow season, already hard, would get worse. That was the way. The season must be faced if they would survive. His sense about the coming storm was stronger than he'd ever felt before. He had no fear. No, he had prepared, obeying the driving urgency to eat, to shelter, and to gather. That always came before the snows. He had obeyed the lessons of his father, heeded the voice of the land, and lived through many snows. He would live through the one to come. He knew his home, saw its bounty. He knew the den of every mouse. He could sniff out the squirrels in their trees, and he could run down deer and outwit bear. Then the season changed its face in the turning of the sun, and Irad had watched the world he knew fade into white as it never did before. The ducks and small birds, always the first to flee the coming snows, had left the moon early. Still he had no fear. The geese followed not long afterward, and when he saw the finches and the sparrows leaving too, uneasiness touched him for the first time. The fierce snow came, and in the still nights that followed, wrapped together with Ada and Jabal against the threatening snow, that voice within, small and quiet, whispered for him to flee. The voice grew louder as the unrelenting snow drifted higher, but by then it was too late to leave. He shrugged off the memory, and the fullness of the moment came back upon him. And he watched his child eat, huddled close to Ada for warmth. He reminded himself once more that he was Irad, champion of the atoll. At the great gathering of the hot season, had he not bested them all? Was he not the last to stand, holding above his head the great stone none other could lift? He could beat the strongest of his kind, and he would beat the snow in the same way. He looked again at Ada and Jabal. He blew a lengthy breath from his lips. He could beat the snow. Yes. Could they? Okay, thanks for joining me on this podcast. I really appreciate you, and I hope you guys are having a great holiday season. Christmas is in a couple of days, and I'm really excited about it. It's been a busy Christmas season for me with work and doing these other things that I do. I'm going to kind of enjoy taking a couple of days off and hanging out with my family and sitting out by the fire and eating some good food. And I hope your Christmas is just as grand as mine is going to be. We never do anything big. It's just great to be around my kids and my grandkids, and my wife works herself to the bone cooking these meals, and anyway, it's just a crazy time, but I love it. So Merry Christmas to everyone, and we'll see you guys next week with more Bigfoot encounters. I love you all. Merry Christmas.